All right, let's talk about one of the biggest, deadliest conflicts in all of human history, World War I. It was a war that completely redrew the map of the world. But how on earth did it even happen? How did it get so catastrophically huge? Let's get into it.
People back then didn't call it World War I. To them, it was just the Great War. And its start wasn't just a single event. It was more like a slow burn, a massive buildup of tension across an entire continent, just waiting for something to set it off.
So think of Europe right before the war as a giant powder keg, just waiting to explode. We need to look at what was in that powder keg, what historians call the long-term causes.
Okay, first up we've got militarism. And this was, basically a massive arms race. For ages, Britain had the world's best navy, but then Germany decided it wanted a powerful navy too, to challenge them. This kicked off this huge competition, creating this atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Everybody started building bigger armies and more powerful weapons.
Next, you have nationalism. And look, we're not just talking about patriotism or loving your country. This was a really intense, sometimes aggressive kind of pride. It also meant that different ethnic groups wanted to break away and form their own nations. This was especially explosive in a region called the Balkans, which was pretty much its own little powder keg inside the bigger one.
And then you throw imperialism into this already messy mix. All the big European powers were in this frantic race to build massive global empires. They were all competing for colonies and resources, especially in Africa and Asia. This constant scramble for land led to all sorts of diplomatic fights and near wars, just making everything even more tense.
And finally, maybe the most important piece to the puzzle, a super complicated web of alliances. Basically, Europe split itself into two big teams. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. These pacts were like a tripwire. If someone attacked one country, all their allies had to jump in. So a small, local fight could instantly become a massive continent-wide war.
So let's recap. You've got the arms race, the intense nationalism, the scramble for colonies, and these tangled alliances. The whole continent is just primed. The powder keg is packed. All it needed was one tiny spark.
And that spark? It came on a summer day, in a city most people back then had probably never even heard of.
Here it is, Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is visiting the city with his wife. And they're assassinated, shot dead by a Serbian nationalist. That one single act of violence, that was the match that lit the fuse.
And what happened next was a chain reaction that nobody, it seems, could stop. This is where that whole alliance system, that tripwire we talked about, just became so incredibly deadly. One country after another got pulled into the chaos. It was like watching dominoes fall, one right after the other. First, Austria-Hungary is furious about the assassination and declares war on Serbia. So Russia, which was allied with Serbia, starts getting its huge army ready. Well, that brings in Germany, who's allied with Austria-Hungary, and they declare war on Russia and Russia's ally, France. Finally, Germany invades neutral Belgium as a shortcut to attack France, and that's the last straw for Britain, who declares war on Germany. Just like that, in a matter of weeks, Europe is at war.
Nobody saw this coming. The leaders, the generals, they all thought, oh, this will be over by Christmas. They could not have been more wrong. What followed was a brutal, grinding war unlike anything the world had ever seen.
So, the image everyone has of World War I, it's trench warfare. And for good reason. Both sides literally dug in, creating these massive, complex networks of ditches to hide from machine guns and artillery. And the result was this awful, bloody stalemate, where millions of men died fighting over just a few hundred yards of mud.
And life for the soldiers in those trenches was absolute hell on earth. They were disgusting, muddy, smelly, filled with rats and crawling with disease. Between the two opposing trench lines was this terrifying area they called no man's land, a wasteland of craters and barbed wire where you were completely exposed to enemy fire.
And this war was fought on an industrial scale, with terrifying new ways to kill. You had tanks, invented to try and cross no man's land, submarines, called U-boats, hunting ships at sea, machine guns that can mow down hundreds of soldiers in minutes, and, for the first time, poison gas, a truly horrifying chemical weapon.
Okay, so after 4 incredibly long, brutal years of the stalemate, things finally started to change. Let's look at how this whole nightmare came to an end
and what kind of peace it left behind.
The real game changer? It came in 1917, when the United States, after staying neutral for years, finally entered the war. The arrival of millions of fresh American soldiers and America's industrial might, that really tipped the scales for the Allies.
By the end of 1918, Germany was just exhausted. Its allies were collapsing, so they signed an armistice, which is just an agreement to stop the fighting. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns on the Western Front finally went silent.
The fighting was over. But now came the hard part, making peace. And the treaty they came up with, the Treaty of Versailles, was incredibly tough on Germany. They forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for the war, pay a massive amount of money in reparations, give up all of its colonies, and shrink its military down to almost nothing.
You can imagine this created a deep sense of resentment and humiliation in Germany. And a lot of historians argue that this, right here, is what planted the seeds for the rise of extremism and eventually the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Second World War.
Which really leaves us with this one big unsettling question. They called it the war to end all wars. But in trying to create a peace, did they punish Germany so harshly that they accidentally paved the way for an even worse conflict? It's a powerful thought, isn't it? How the end of one war can hold the beginning of another.